I run something called the Race Card Project. And that means that I collect short stories about race and identity. Really short stories. Stories that are only 6 words long. I ask people to share their thoughts with me about race in America in very short spurts. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that, but first I'm going to tell you about why I decided to embark on this crazy endeavor. I wrote a book 3 years ago called The Grace of Silence. And in writing that book, I learned quite a bit about my family. And I learned quite a bit about America. And I realized that I was going to be engaging in conversations about race, and so I had to figure out how I could invite people into those conversations in a way that would make people feel more comfortable. And so much of what I'm going to talk to you tonight about, do you mind if I walk around? Is that okay? I figure since I'm on a lavalier, I don't have to stand behind the left hip. I can actually move around a little bit. Much of what I'm going to talk to you about are sort of unintended consequences, things that happened that weren't supposed to be. I was the person who never wanted to talk about race. I now run something called the Race Card Project. I wrote a book called The Grace of Silence, which is a family memoir. I brought a copy of it so you can see it. The Grace of Silence, and there's 3 words behind it, a family memoir. And I always feel like there should be a 4th word, an accidental family memoir, because this was not the book that I set out to write. I began working on this book around the time of the 2008 presidential election, something that you in this state will certainly remember, for lots of reasons. And at the time, there was this interesting thing going on where, because of the, at that point, the candidacy of Barack Obama, now President Obama, but at that time candidate Barack Obama, there was a lot of talk about America moving into a post-racial status. The word post-racial was suddenly everywhere. And I've done some research on this. It's interesting. Words don't usually bubble up like this, but that word was nowhere, and then suddenly it was everywhere. And people were talking about this, and I thought, what does that mean? In fact, we're at a college campus. I can actually ask you questions, where the professor would. You heard the term post-racial all of a sudden. At the time when you heard it, what did you think it meant to you? What did it sound like it meant? Anyone?
Racism was over.
That we're past race, that racism was over and race was over, something we didn't have to talk about anymore? Huh. How'd that turn out? That they keep adjusting the point at which we will reach majority-minority status, at which point you need all kinds of new language, because majority-minority just, whoa, you know, it's like jumbo shrimp. You just have to, we have to kind of figure out how we're going to talk about this. And I can actually imagine a time where the term race morphs into something else. And I actually would welcome that. I don't know what it morphs into. One of the reasons I would welcome that is because when you talk about race, one of the reasons I think that it's difficult is because there is the actual fact of racism. But there is the assumption that if you're going to talk about race, what you're actually talking about is racism. And there's a difference. There's a big difference. So I don't necessarily subscribe to the theory that we are post-racial or that we even need to be post-racial. Because post-racial, as you suggested, is this idea that we'll get to the point where race is no longer important. I would love, within my lifetime, or really within anyone's lifetime, to get to the point where racism is no longer important. If we could eradicate racism, I'm down for that. I don't know that we want to eradicate race, though. Because race is, that describes the room. That's sort of who we are. And it's not always race, sometimes it's ethnicity, because they're not the same thing. I mean, just as an aside, when I first was collecting stories, the Latino population was greatly underrepresented in the inbox. And so I call it the Race Card Project, but when I talk about it, I talk about race and identity. And I'm collecting stories about race and cultural identity. And the inbox started to reflect a broader diaspora stories, because if you were Latino, for instance, and it's the race car project, it's not a race. You're thinking, well, she's not talking about me. So I'm not going to, I don't want to participate in that. So words do count. And I think that it's, from what I've learned and what I've observed in looking at America, it's kind of silly to think that we would get to the point where we would no longer look at multiculturalism as an issue in this country, because it's so much a part of who we are. And it's actually viewed outside of America as one of this country's strengths. I talked about this earlier today. I spent a lot of time this past year, in 2013, researching the March on Washington, because we did a series on the March on Washington. It was the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And I did all of this research, and part of the research I was looking overseas, the coverage overseas, was a big story, huge story. So many of the overseas outlets talked about America's multiculturalism. They didn't use that term because that wasn't a term that was used in 1963. But they talked about that this crowd, it was this multi-ethnic crowd, that blacks and whites were standing together. Because, that was the first time that for many people, it was literally the first time that they stood next to someone of a different color. Because that generally didn't happen. DC is a southern city. It's not the kind of thing that you saw there. But it was noted time and time again that this was this feature of the march that people overseas marveled at. And today, if you look at overseas coverage, it's one of the things that people note. It's one of the reasons students want to come and study in America, is because they want to experience a society that's not necessarily homogenous. And yet, in this country, whenever we talk about race or multiculturalism, it has to eat your peas quality about it. It's like there's the Tuesday diversity session that you have to go to at work, because it's like, we have to do this, as opposed to seeing it as something that is a benefit, that is one of our strengths. And that's, again, the way we talk about it, and the way we frame it, maybe for the next generation, we can present it in a way that is seen as something that is a benefit as opposed to a burden.